Well, welcome everyone to tonight's program, Faith, Freedom, and the Great War, Religious Meaning in World War I. I'm Jonathan Eder, Programs Manager at the Mary Baker Eddy Library, and I'm just so pleased that you're with us tonight as we delve into this subject, which will bring us back to an earlier period, but will engage us with issues that I think have an enduring relevance for us today. So we'll be delving into a time of great conflict, of great stress for people, and what that meant for them in terms of how they brought their spiritual convictions to that issue and that crisis at that time. I thought we would begin our program this evening with a performance of a song that had great relevance in that time and is certainly pertinent to the subject of our program this evening. And by way of introduction, I'm going to read from one of our panelists' books. Quote, November 11th, 1918, brought the end of the Great War. By the terms of the armistice, the conflict among armies ended at 11 a.m. On the Sunday, after the guns went quiet, the American Church of the Holy Trinity in Paris opened its military service of thanksgiving for victory with the popular hymn, Onward Christian Soldiers.
Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. Christ, the royal master, leads against the foe, forward into battle. Banner the triumph song. Glory, laud, and honor unto Christ the King. This through countless ages, men and angels sing. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before.
Well, bravo, singers. You've set a very wonderful tone for this evening's conversation. And what I love this is the first time I've heard them perform this, but it brought out so many of the different kind of qualities that I think are at work in our discussion today. It was, generally, I think of that song as a kind of militant, robust song, and that certainly was in your presentation. But there are also these moments of great intimacy and tenderness and sweetness in that song, and all of that is at work in terms of what we're going to be examining in our conversation today about the religious meaning of World War I and what it had to do with faith and what it had to do with people's cherished beliefs around what really underlies freedom and allows us to enjoy that possibility of self-determination and spiritual advancement through that free exercise of religion. So thank you so much for that wonderful version of Onward Christian Soldiers. I feel like another round of applause is almost in order. I think also in relation to tonight's program that particular song is so relevant in that for many people there is a tension between the idea of being Christian and being a soldier. That in the Bible, of course, we hear the injunction to love one's enemies, but we also hear the injunction that there is no greater love than to lay one's life down for one's friends. And I think that both of those impulses were very much alive in American thought as the war started, and then that conviction around the importance of bringing a sense of commitment and sacrifice when struggle and conflict really demanded it, assumed the convictions of American culture. So we're going to be looking at how that transition happened and really what it meant for both individuals but also religious bodies in a war where people with the same religious background, the same religious ideals, the same religious formation, the same sacred texts were at opposing sides. So there's so much for us to engage with this evening, and I'm so pleased you're with us tonight to share in this conversation. I want to make you aware that that later in the program there'll be an opportunity to submit, there's an opportunity to submit questions at any point, but later in the program we'll be engaging with any questions or observations you'd like to share with the panel to delve into those more deeply. And I believe this is how you'll find where to submit the question by going to mbelibrary.org/questions. We've chosen just to receive questions online, so people here in the audience, I hope you're equipped or a neighbor is equipped with a smartphone so you can email in your question or type in your question that way. We found that maybe that's more expeditious in terms of engaging with programs, although we'll miss hearing your actual voices in sharing a question this evening. So I'm just so delighted with our panel and whom we have to share with you this evening. So I'll introduce them all first, and then we'll hear from them. First, I'd love to introduce to you Dr. Jonathan Ebel. He's here immediately to my left. He is a professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Religion at the University of Illinois. And last year, John was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in the study of religion. He's the author of the book I quoted from earlier, Faith in the Fight, Religion and the American Soldier in the Great War, published by Princeton University Press, and G.I. Messiahs, War and American Civil Religion, from Yale University Press. I should note that John received his BA at Harvard, so I'm glad to see that you're sharing your talents with other Ivy League institutions and their publishing arms, so that shows great spirit on your part, particularly with the Yale University Press. John's background is truly interdisciplinary. He's had a career as a naval intelligence officer and has been active in Illinois politics. So welcome, John.
Thank you.
Next to John is Judy Huenneke, colleague of mine. She is Senior Research Archivist at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. And I think it's fair to say that no one knows our collections better than Judy. She's been an archivist with the library and with the First Church of Christ Scientists for many years. Judy has master degrees in library and information science as well as in history. And I found that that's a great combination because it means that Judy knows what she knows, but she also knows exactly why it is she knows what she knows. So welcome, Judy. And then finally, furthest down is Christian Harder. Christian is a native of both Austria and the United States. Christian studied historical linguistics at Harvard University with additional studies in nationalism and identity. He has 20 years of experience with international publications at the Christian Science Publishing Society. He is currently issue developer for the French and German editions of the Herald of Christian Science. So welcome, Christian, and thank you so much for your beautiful singing. If you feel like doing a solo, I think that would be well.
No, not happening.
So, John, I thought I'd start with you
Sure.
to give us sort of that broad picture of what the war meant for religion in America and American culture and its religious convictions.
Yeah, and I'll approach that question through the lens of the religion of American soldiers, which has been my academic interest for a long time. But before I do that, I want to thank you for the invitation and thank all of you for being here. This is a homecoming for me in a couple of senses. First, as Jonathan noted, I did spend 4 bright college years here in the Boston area. This is also a homecoming to academic conversations. I've spent the last year campaigning for Congress in Illinois. The voters of Illinois' 13th district put an abrupt end to that chapter in my life last Tuesday. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be answering questions about religion in World War I and not about how I plan to pay for Medicare for all. Somebody else's problem now. So I somewhat coincidentally here have a paper that's titled Onward Christian Soldiers. Thank you so much for the hypnotic introduction there. And I want to note as I begin that anthem we just heard rendered so beautifully, echoed often in the American Cathedral in Paris, where American servicemen worshiped both during and after the Great War. It filled the air in New York City in December of 1918, before an American war hero addressed a gathering organized by the city's Episcopal churches. 3 years later, the cavalry band accompanying the unknown soldier's funeral cortege played it as well. The words of the hymn captured the imaginations of America's faithful, helping them make sense of not only the Great War writ large, quoting here, "At the sign of triumph, Satan's host doth flee, on then Christian soldiers, on to victory," unquote, but also of their role in it. And I'll quote from the hymn again, "We are not divided, all one body we, one in hope and doctrine, one in charity." The war against Hell's minions was directed by God and would be won by a unified Christian effort. Onward, Christian soldiers. It was an appealing vision, good versus evil, God versus devil, unity produced and sustained in the fires of war. But for all of its appeal, this notion stood a good distance from reality. Moral positions in the war were not as clear as the hymn argues. Unity in the terms framed by the hymn, hope, doctrine, charity, was elusive. Students of the faith of the American soldier, the doughboy, have something of a problem. Namely, in the American context and the American experience of the Great War, it's hard to say anything conclusive, anything unifying about soldierly religion as traditionally imagined. I want to try, though, and I'll do so in 3 parts. First, I'll give a brief survey of the American religious landscape out of which the American Expeditionary Force was raised. I want to suggest that while Onward Christian Soldiers paints an inaccurate picture of religion in the American Expeditionary Force, the communal singing of it, or any other song, can tell us something about the religiousness of the American soldier. Second, I will offer a brief description of America's war experience, focusing on what sets it apart from experiences of other combatant nations. I will also describe the ways in which religion was present to American soldiers during their time in France. Lastly, I will take up the challenge of describing the faith of the American soldier. In this important task, I believe we do well to foreground expressions of religion that flow across the boundaries of tradition and that challenge narratives of secularization, disillusionment, and irony, which have never had an especially firm grip on the souls of Americans. So let's start with the American religious landscape. Wartime and post-war observers tended to think of soldierly religion as defined by interactions with religious institutions and clergy. They measured the religiosity against predictable benchmarks, such as a soldier's knowledge of doctrine. Reports from the so-called Protestant mainline and from the hierarchy of the Catholic Church expressed a mix of concern and hope. In his preface to the post-war report, Religion Among American Men, Chief of Chaplains Reverend Charles Brent wrote, quote, "There is one generalization in particular, which the evidence in hand makes it necessary to record. The widespread ignorance on elementary religious matters, even of those who professed to be church members. Perhaps the one exception was among the Roman Catholics," unquote. This is not especially surprising. Young men of fighting age are not renowned for their piety or their eagerness to engage in God talk. One of my colleagues likes to say the 18 to 25 demographic is where faith goes to die. But the challenge doesn't end with the apathy or reticence of this demographic. The changing shape of America's Protestant denominations and in the many tributaries of the American Catholic Church make the faith of the American soldier still more difficult to map. The draft caught not only mainline Protestants and Catholics, but Pentecostals, Christian Scientists, Mormons, members of the Church of God in Christ, Native Americans, Muslims, Sikhs, and Jews, all groups that in their own ways troubled attempts to generalize and assess religion. This diversity requires that we qualify and requalify almost every statement we would make about religion among American soldiers. If, for instance, we think of Protestant soldiers as believing in sin as personal failing, a matter to be addressed between a man and his God, we must also note that some Protestant soldiers were raised in liberal churches, both urban and rural, in which pastors and laity articulated and acted upon a social gospel that preached communal sin and communal salvation. The religious diversity of the American Expeditionary Force and of the nation from which it was drawn make attempts at generalization extremely difficult. But this diversity presents us with lessons concerning the definition of religion and challenges us to look in other places for religious commonalities. Excuse me while I take a sip. So let's say a little bit about America's war experience. The experience of the Great War, America's experience of the Great War, was by comparison to other major combatants, short. Congress responded to President Wilson's request by declaring war on April 6th, declaring war on the Central Powers in April of 1917. The late spring and early summer brought the first efforts at registering men for the draft and then calling them into service. It wasn't until November of 1917 that American troops began to arrive in Europe in meaningful numbers, and it was the spring of 1918, a whole year after the official declaration of war, that the AEF made its presence felt in combat. Unlike their allies, American soldiers did not experience the grinding repetition of annual combat cycles or the dehumanizing conditions of sustained trench warfare. The overwhelming majority joined the fight when it was in a more fluid and, as it turned out, a terminal stage. They fought, were wounded, and died, to be sure, but their gains were generally held, and the enemy had little of the material, personnel, or psychological resiliency of 1915, 1916, and 1917. After less than a year of large-scale American involvement, the war was over. Far from undermining American myths of martial efficacy and the nobility of suffering for a cause, the American experience validated those myths at multiple levels, creating among American soldiers a deeper attachment to those myths and a nostalgia for the experiences that created them. Religious institutions were involved in the American war effort from the very beginning. Religion was most visibly present via the chaplaincy, a small but growing cadre of clergymen selected for duty by their denominations. This did not mean, however, that the soldier faithful could always locate and worship with one of their own. At the height of the chaplaincy's staffing, there was only one chaplain for every 3,000 soldiers. Under quiet conditions and behind the lines, Catholic soldiers could seek out priests for Mass, and Protestant soldiers could gather with Protestant clergymen. But soldiers were often forced into a lived ecumenism, whether they liked it or not. Religious agencies, such as the Young Men's Christian Association and the Knights of Columbus and the Salvation Army, maintained a strong presence among the soldiers, providing reminders of home and its comforts. YMCA huts could be used for worship services, but they also served as centers for entertainment and athletics, venues for writing letters home, and as canteens for the sale of cigarettes and chocolate. Religion was, thus, present in the soldiers' experience in recognizable forms and institutions, but those institutions themselves were evidence of the breadth of religion in the world of the soldier. The YMCA saw itself as performing a religious duty by providing soldiers with an outlet for their athletic energies, an occasion for a laugh, and stationery to write their mothers. Would it be strange if soldiers themselves saw these activities as religious? Taking communion from a clergyman certainly indicated some sort of religious concern. What about the taking of a donut from a Salvation Army lass? So now I'm going to transition to saying a little bit more about the soldier's religion as I envision it. So, what can we say about the religion of the American soldier, given this maze of denominational affiliations and experiences of war, not to mention the myriad ways that religion had been present in the pre-war lives and was present to them in war's midst? I propose that the faith of the American soldier was a multidimensional organism, the first dimension of which was indeed tradition or denominational affiliation. Soldiers used the labels Catholic, Methodist, Jew, Christian Scientist to name themselves and to describe themselves, to name others and to describe themselves. Doctrines and practices familiar to them from these denominational contexts shaped not only their observance, but also the ways that they talked and thought about the war and its meaning. But soldiers did not treat these labels as rigid. The second dimension of the soldier's religion was nationalism, or what we might call civil religion. The tendency to treat the United States and its history as indicative of an ongoing righteousness of purpose played a significant role in shaping soldierly interpretations of the war and its meaning. Claims that God was on the side of the Allies were almost always mediated through the belief that the United States had a covenantal relationship with God. A third dimension of the American soldier's religiosity was what I have called communitas, the experience of shared concern, effort, and sacrifice. The young men who went to war and found themselves joined to a novel and transient community deemed the experience transformative, and regularly recalled the joys and sorrows they shared while at war. A great many of them spent time after the war trying to create and sustain facsimiles of this community, such as the American Legion. Yet we can't understand the communal dimension of soldierly religion apart from a fourth dimension, the experience of combat. For it wasn't just any community in which soldiers learned of ultimate value. It was in a community of soldiers fighting and dying, unified by an experience incomprehensible to those who stood outside of it. Soldiers described combat as simultaneously terrifying and thrilling, invigorating and paralyzing, and above all, as I've noted, transformative. With life and death brought so close together and survival reduced to basics, soldiers claimed to see truth. A fifth dimension of soldierly religion was a claim to authority, religious and civic, derived from service in war. Soldiers and veterans argued vigorously that one who had gone to war, who had been willing to give everything for the nation, deserved special influence in defining and defending that which was truly American. A sixth and final dimension centers on death, memorial practices, understandings of the afterlife, and the theology of sacrificial death that so many shared. In the course of war, and certainly in its aftermath, soldiers sought to make sense of death in war, what it meant, how it related to ultimate fate and salvation, how to memorialize the fallen. Here we see a clearly religious concern expressed in an overtly religious idiom, but mediated through civil religion and only loosely related to the doctrines of a denomination or religious tradition. So what makes these six dimensions religious? What makes them a better way to describe the religion of American soldiers than simply applying common denominational labels? First, using discourses tied not just to Christianity or Judaism, but also to the United States, the military, and to combat experiences, soldiers oriented themselves and their purpose toward higher realities. The mythology of war, the symbolic idioms of Christianity, and the rituals of military life added content and structure to this soldierly religion. Moreover, as doughboys thought about death in the afterlife, and as the U.S. government built memorial spaces, they made it clear that death in war cleansed the soldier of sin. These dimensions of soldierly religion couldn't craft or sustain this theology individually. Their power was in the web they formed. Second, I believe that we need to think this way about soldierly religion because soldiers are people, and people live religion only partially in institutions. We often encounter and explain worlds of wonder on our own and in ways that are, frankly, unorthodox. As a historian of the religions of Americans, I don't have a dog in recurring fights about doctrinal correctness, ritual efficacy, homiletical style, or catechetical shortcomings. I am interested in religious pasts, and when I can hear them, in echoes of those pasts. And what I hear and see are young men and women who, sometimes to the frustration of clergy and Sunday school teachers, drew on a wide range of sources to help explain the world around them. We can't recover all of these sources or even name them, but we can acknowledge that religion, as traditionally imagined, is neither an isolated phenomenon or an all-encompassing one. And before we ask a question such as, how did believers in a religion of peace end up going to war, we should ask how fully we understand the beliefs of those believers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, John. That a lot for us to consider with that. We are the Mary Baker Eddy Library, and so much of what you were talking about seemed to be about religion really deriving first and foremost from people's lived experience, and war as an experience that really can shape a religious consciousness and religious bond that go goes beyond denominations and reveals itself in a new way that really does need to be examined and considered, and is in your book. So, I recommend them to you. So, thanks so much, John.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to Judy, who is going to explore with us what our collections here at the Mary Baker Eddy Library have to say and reveal about the Christian Science perspective on World War I.
Yes, and I think I got a wonderful introduction from John as a result of him talking about what people believe, because my talk is titled Believing in War, the Christian Science Church and the First World War. So we're going to be focusing more on what the Christian Science Church was saying about this war than about what individuals who were Christian scientists or who were soldiers had to say. So let's begin. How do religious people confront a war? Spiritually minded men and women and religious organizations have been facing this from the earliest days of civilization. Can those who believe in peace and love as sacred also advocate for violence and hatred? Can Jews and Christians who view "thou shalt not kill" as a commandment from divinity also view it as qualified at times? Perhaps we can all agree that the challenge faced by many over the millennia is that these are not simple questions, and so the answers are equally complex. So I had to keep this in mind as I researched how the Christian Science Church faced war during the years 1914 to 1918. I thought I just wanted to find out what happened and provide an explanation when I could. But I found out that wasn't such a simple goal. We're going to have to view this as an ongoing project, not finished tonight. I believe we'll need to keep digging in the archives, and I expect that more stories will emerge. One early realization for me was that the story doesn't really begin in 1914, when World War I started. It really starts when the Christian Science Church first faced the question of war. Now, the church was founded by Mary Baker Eddy in 1879, and the first relevant statements that I found came out in 1898. This was in response to the Spanish-American War. An editorial in the church's monthly periodical, the Christian Science Journal, asked the question, "Do Christian scientists believe in war?" That was the title. The editor, Septimus Hanna, was himself a veteran of the Civil War, and he did not find this an easy question to answer. You can feel his wrestlings in these excerpts that I'm going to quote. Christian scientists look to the Bible for their authority in all affairs, divine and human. If the Bible teaches that war is a divine institution, Christian scientists should feel themselves obliged to regard it as such. Can it be then that a God of love can consistently act as commander-in-chief of an army whose avowed purpose is the annihilation of large numbers of human beings? It may be answered from the personal literal standpoint that he who is at once a God of love and a God of justice may consistently do this. But here we encounter a difficulty. If a personal God personally interferes with the battles of earth, he must take sides. And which side shall he take? And he goes on at some length about these difficult topics. So in the end, though, Hanna concluded that Christian scientists were patriotic and would serve in this war if called upon, but that they would hope for a speedy end of the unhappy tragedy. So 10 years later, in 1908, church founder Mary Baker Eddy made a brief statement titled War. This was responding to peace movements, one actually headed up by a Christian scientist, that advocated for peace by arbitration and adequate armament. So here's her statement. For many years, I have prayed daily that there be no war, no more barbarous slaughtering of our fellow beings. Prayed that all the peoples on earth and the islands of the sea have one God, one mind, love God supremely, and love their neighbor as themselves. National disagreements can be and should be arbitrated wisely, fairly, and fully settled. It is unquestionable, however, that at this hour, the armament of navies is necessary for the purpose of preventing war and preserving peace among nations. So that's her statement. Now, 6 years later, by 1914, when the First World War began, Eddy had been deceased nearly 4 years, but I think her sentiments largely prevailed among Christian scientists. In fact, in May 1914, a few months before the war actually started, periodical editor Archibald McClellan quoted Eddy's war statement and added, "Above all else, we must be careful to resist the clamor which at a time like this attempts to sway public opinion by appeals to prejudice and sentiment rather than to divine justice and love." But as we know, a few months later, war broke out in Europe. However, the U.S. did not enter the conflict. By late October 1914, the Mother Church in Boston, the headquarters of the Christian Science movement, took action with the establishment of what they called a War Relief Fund. The fund was initially designed to assist only Christian scientists in Europe, but its outreach quickly expanded to include anyone in need, regardless of religious affiliation, supplying food, clothing, and money. The contributions were not supporting any one side in the conflict, but at this point were assisting people in the Netherlands, England, France, Switzerland, and Germany. This humanitarian work was eagerly supported, and leaving out the politics was likely a relief to many church members. Now, why was this? Well, then as now, Christian Science was an international religion. While centered in the United States, Christian Science had found many adherents in Germany, France, and England. In other words, on both sides of the war. In fact, the first translation of Eddy's primary work, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, was into German, and it had been published less than a year before hostilities broke out. The church's German language magazine, then called Der Herald der Christian Science, which Christian will be discussing in more detail, had a healthy circulation in the US and abroad. So, could a neutral approach continue? An early challenge was the May 1915 sinking of the Lusitania, a British ship, by the Germans. There were a number of Americans aboard. A short while later, at the church's annual meeting, the church president, Edward A. Merritt, who was an American, asked the membership a question rather similar to Hannah's 1898 question. In time of war, he asked, what then should be the nature of the thought and the demeanor of Christian scientists? And here's a little bit of what he had to say. Much has been said about neutrality, and we know that there is only one way to be neutral. The activity of the Christ shows us the way, and there is no other. Christian scientists must be more active than ever, must at all times and under all circumstances overcome evil with good, that last statement being actually from Mary Baker Eddy's Science and Health. The tension underlying this neutrality became more apparent months later when it was far more certain that the United States would enter the war. Editor McClellan, in a February 1917 editorial, again touched on the question of whether Christian scientists believe in war by looking at Mary Baker Eddy's historical example, noting her support for the Spanish-American War. He concluded, until humanity has fully grasped the truth of universal peace, it will be necessary for Christian scientists, as well as for all the others, to do whatever the world's highest sense of human rights demands of them. Now, McClellan was right, for weeks later, on April 6, 1917, the United States entered the war. Vigorously patriotic editorials would continue in the Christian Science magazines throughout the war, and this was probably a good thing, for it may well be that the Christian Science periodicals, in particular the Herald of Christian Science with its German-speaking readership, were viewed with a little suspicion. So let me explain. The United States Postmaster General, Albert Sidney Burleson, empowered by what was called the Espionage Act, was ruthless in his quest to censor publications that he felt were treasonous or seditious and remove them from the mails. The concern that foreign language publications, which couldn't be read perhaps by most of the people in the post office, that these might slip through the cracks was solved with the imposition of additional restrictions in late 1917. And I'm going to read what one historian has to say about this. The name of this was the Trading with the Enemy Act. That act required foreign language newspapers to submit to the Post Office Department in advance of publication English translations of all articles or editorials referring to the government, to any of the belligerent powers, or to the conduct of the war. Burleson wielded this new authority with the same unremitting fierceness that he had shown to the radical press, with the result that the country's many foreign language publications either converted to an unqualified and even overblown support for the government, or simply shut up shop, many never to reopen. While we really don't know how the Christian Science periodicals were affected by these new restrictions, we do know that about this same time, major changes were made in the format of the church's German language publications to include English on facing pages. By January 1918, the German Herald was a bilingual publication. That same month, January 1918, William P. Mackenzie, who had become the editor in 1917 following the passing of McClellan, wrote an editorial titled "The Courage of the Peacemaker." It reminds me of the sentiments voiced by the soldiers that John Ebel chronicles in his book, Faith in the Fight. And here's the quote from Mackenzie. "Christ Jesus could have avoided death by being a pacifist, by not cleansing the temple, by not contending with false teaching, by not declaring unpleasant but necessary truth. But by fighting the battle through for righteousness, he both conquered the sin that sought to slay him and overcame death itself. It is by the threat and fear of death that wrong seeks to hold man in bondage, and he who would save life by serving wrong is the one who really loses it. Whereas the Master's promise is perpetual, whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. Therefore it is that they who hold to principle, even to going through death, can hear the trumpet word of the true peacemaker saying, 'Today shalt thou be with me in paradise.' Many in the world are understanding what it means to lay down their lives for their friends. Let us be glad for all the heroes of faith who have fought and do fight for the triumph of good, not counting their own lives dear unto themselves. Are not they the true peacemakers? Therefore, as we estimate the blessings bought for us by noble lives, self-sacrificed in the contest with evil and in establishing the triumph of goodness, let us remember how blessed are the peacemakers." End quote. While it seems that the church magazines were offering some strongly political and pro-government opinions, I was very much surprised to find that in July 1918, editor Mackenzie wrote in a most touching way about the German Herald of Christian Science. He was asking the readership not to see it as an enemy publication and urging them to support the Herald. He says, "It seems clear then that Christian scientists should not take a superficial view that as Der Herald der Christian Science offers translations in the tongue of those against whom so many countries are at war, it must be judged from that fact alone and not from its contents, its motives, and its potencies for good." Mackenzie's statement was certainly a bold one, given the suppression that's prevailed. Fortunately for the Herald and the other Christian Science magazines, the war ended a few months later, in November 1918. But there's really no conclusion to wrestling over the rightness or wrongness of believing in war. This didn't end in 1918, of course. We can look back at what was called the war to end all wars, and we're well aware that instead of ending war, this conflict triggered the horrors of World War II. I think there were some who could see that this might happen. A year after the conclusion of the hostilities, in an editorial designed to support the establishment of the League of Nations, editor Mackenzie commented, "It sometimes happens that the right-minded and good-humored people of the world are called upon to fight the others who believe in war. It is necessary then, if not for the protection of their property, yet for the protection of human beings, of women and children, that the workers in peace should sometimes take up arms and fight. They may do this not at all with war in their hearts, but with courage, resolution, and faith. But if all in the world who reverence the moral law, if all who love peace and orderly ways and the joy of constructive work were united, they could proclaim a prohibitive no to all the proposers of war, and thus the prophecy would be naturally fulfilled which says of the nations, 'They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid.'" And Mackenzie also observed, "This unity of those who have understanding hearts is essential." A century later, unfortunately, it's gotten no easier to find that unity, that understanding. But let's use these century-old examples as our way to continue to explore the meaning of war and conflict in general. So now let's turn from an overall look at the Christian Science church during the Great War to a focus on Christian scientists in Germany and the church's German language monthly magazine. So, Christian.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Judy. Thank you, Jonathan, and Jonathan as well. So Jonathan has told us something about the role of religion in war, as seen in the United States, and Judy about the response of this church to war. Now I'll be talking a little bit about the effect of the war on the church, and specifically on its non-English publishing activities that Judy's already talked a little bit about. To do that, we need a little bit of perspective, a little bit of context. So I'll add to some of the historical information that Judy's already given. The Herald of Christian Science was established in 1903. At that time, it was the Church's only periodical publication that was not in English, and it joined the monthly Christian Science Journal and weekly Christian Science Sentinel that contain religious articles and testimonies of healing. Both of those are English publications, obviously. When the Herald was established in 1903, it was in response to specific requests from people in Germany, but also from German speakers outside Germany, particularly in the United States, who wanted to have Christian Science literature that they could share with people who were not familiar with the religion, to present it to them in the language that they could understand. And that gives some idea of how widespread the use of German was in the United States at that time. Now, one of the things that we'll be looking at is a radical shift in how the Herald was produced and what the content of the Herald was that took place towards the end of World War I, when the United States entered the war, and then in the post-war years. But as a baseline for that, I want to start by looking at what the Herald was doing in 1912, pre-war. At that time, the Herald was produced, as Judy alluded to, in a German-only edition. It used the traditional German alphabet, and in the testimony section of the magazine, where we know something about who the authors were, where they came from, and in most cases what their native language was, about 70% of the content at that time was provided by native German speakers, mostly in Germany itself, some in other parts of Europe, but also German émigrés in the United States and other parts of the world. The balance was almost entirely made up of translations from English. All of the editing and publication work, printing, everything was done here in Boston, even though the language, of course, was German. The submissions that were not originally written in German were chosen from the Christian Science Journal and Christian Science Sentinel, so there was overlap in the content among the three magazines. By 1916, the number of submissions from German speakers was beginning to decline. And it looks like that has mostly to do with delivery problems, with postal issues, because there was a war going on. It was not always easy to get mail back and forth. And I believe that that's the case because at that time, there was no other indication in the Church's activity of any sort of disengagement with German-speaking members or German-speaking audience. In fact, in 1916, the first translation of the Church's governing document, the Church Manual, was published, a translation into German, which, I'll just go on a brief digression, that book, also written by Mary Baker Eddy, today, when it's published in translation, always has the English original on one page and translation on the facing page. In that first German translation, that was not the case. It was German only. And several months later, that was replaced by a bilingual edition at substantial expense. The publisher advertised in all of the church magazines, English and German. Anyone who had the German-only edition of the manual could write in for a free replacement with the bilingual edition at the church's expense. So there was substantial financial investment in German-speaking members and the German-speaking public. But by 1917, of course, the United States was getting into the war. And changes were about to take place with the Herald that took effect, as Judy mentioned, at the beginning of 1918, but given the lead times for print publication, those changes would have been being planned and put into effect in the spring and summer of 1917, so really immediately after the United States entered the war. Those changes included the addition of the English-facing pages that Judy mentioned, but there were also several others. The magazine was no longer printed in the traditional German alphabet. That was replaced with the Roman alphabet. The testimony section that had previously been organized geographically, with all of the testimonies by German speakers up front, and then any remaining ones translated from other languages following after, was reorganized, or you could even say disorganized. The testimonies appeared at random, all mixed together. The proportion of testimonies submitted by German speakers, however, went down to almost nothing. In 1912, and for the years following, it had been about 70%. By 1918, it was below 10%. At the same time, the church introduced a French edition of the Herald, January 1918. And that French Herald had exactly the same content as the German Herald at that time, and in fact for the 50 years following as well. That was also bilingual and arranged the same way. And so what we see is a shift from a magazine really specifically for Germans, by Germans to a large extent, to a magazine in a couple of different forms, in French and German, that is very specifically not for Germans or German speakers, even though, of course, it still has the German language in it. But then we get to the post-war period and the New World Order that Arthur mentioned earlier. It seems like a new balance was found in the early 1920s. The number of German submissions began to increase again. It never went back up to the 70% that it used to be, but it did reach into 40 to 50% range. And there were other changes as well that show the church striving to produce a publication that would build bridges, that would unite people, and that would support the globalist New World Order that Arthur was mentioning. And so we see the church engaging actively in the post-war order that tried to go beyond the simple nationalism of producing a magazine. This is the magazine for this country. Now, this is a magazine for the world to show the universal interest and applicability of Christian Science and to build those bridges. One other thing that Judy mentioned that I'd like to circle back to is the War Relief Fund. One of the things that you see frequently in the testimonies from all parts of the world in the later part of the war and the post-war period is gratitude for that fund. You can see directly how, as Judy mentioned, it was supporting people on both sides of the conflict in very meaningful ways. Finally, I'd like to just read an excerpt from one of the testimonies published after the war by a German soldier that shows, I think, something of the attitude of Christian Science, some Christian scientists to the war. with a grateful and happy heart, I wish to testify to the wonderful manner in which God's love protected and guided me during the war, and the help which I have received through Christian Science. As I was going to the front, this serious question confronted me, and this echoes many of the questions that Judy raised from editorials and other content. What stand shall I take toward my opponent during the battle? The answer was the simple statement made by Mrs. Eddy in miscellaneous writings: love thine enemies is identical with thou hast no enemies. It became clear to me that if I had no enemies, I would never be placed in a position where I would have to defend myself against them or be compelled to injure them. With this firm assurance, I departed not to the war, but to work in the vineyard of the Lord. And this assurance was not in vain, for although I was in the front line and had to patrol far into enemy territory, I was never placed in the position where it was necessary to use weapons. I think that's also an interesting response to Jonathan's comments on the American approach to the war. Everyone on both sides of the conflict was conflicted one way or another, but certainly on both sides of the conflict there was that strong feeling, this is my fellow man, and these are my fellow believers, fellow children of God. I cannot hurt them, and I cannot be forced to.
Thank you so much, Christian. Christian's comments bring me back to something from John Ebel's book, his other book, G.I. Messiah's Soldiering War and American Civil Religion. Because what I sort of felt happened with the panel is we built from your idea, John Ebel, of the soldiering experience expanding a sense of religion and a sense of religious bond across denominations for those who are sharing in that war experience, to one where we're seeing that even extend to a bond between combatants, between the two opposing sides, both looking for something in that war experience that brings them to a higher level, perhaps a deeper insight into how God is still present in their lives and caring for them as God must be caring for all who are participating. And I was intrigued by this passage in your book, G.I. Messiahs, and it's about a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Charles White Whittisley. And he comes back from the war, and he receives a great deal of fanfare and celebration as a war hero. And he gives this speech, and this speech takes place right here in Boston, I believe, here on the Boston Common. And and then to quote, in this speech, quote, he informed the audience that there was a noticeable lack of hatred in the trenches. And he says, our men who have been facing and fighting the Germans won't come back hating them. Why, they might even share their cigarettes with the Kaiser himself if they met him on the road. And then an observer from the Outlook, a newspaper, I presume, noted, silence greeted this portion of the speaker's address, a contrast to the vigorous applause which punctuated the rest. So that's intriguing to me, that sort of difference between the lived religious experience of those most involved in the war itself and those in the cultures sort of behind the scenes, behind the action. And I'd love to just sort of hear your comments, John, and others about that sort of distinction between religious meaning for soldiers and then religious meaning for those who are observers and sort of behind the battle lines.
Yeah, am I mic'd up? Well, it's clear that there is a division, and there's been extensive research done from the Civil War forward on how difficult it was. The Army has gotten a lot more effective in subsequent decades, but through World War I and into World War II, how difficult it was to get soldiers to shoot to kill, which I think is an expression of the phenomenon that you're talking about, and points up the real chasm that exists between experiences of war as we imagine them as civilians and experiences of war as they're lived by soldiers. And I mean, it's something that's very much in circulation in our culture now. I'm not sure how many of you are engaged at all with the fiction and writing of kind of the new veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq, but there's some really amazing writing that's happening from those men and women. And I mean, it's an enduring issue, and the extent to which religion crosshashes it is also, I think, most underscored in, and we were talking earlier today about man's extremity and God's opportunity, and how that's viewed in very different ways by those who wear the cloth and by those who wear the uniform, and the experience of war, something that I alluded to in my talk, is something that becomes kind of a foundation for critiquing religious leadership and critiquing broader society, and it seems to be one of the enduring features. I think. I mean, we see it from ancient literature on now to the writings of people like Phil Cly, and great book, Redeployment. If any of you are looking for something to read, this chasm that exists between the two groups.
Well, we have received some questions which I'd like to share with you, panelists, and just to remind you that if you do, those of you online and those of you here, if you do want to send in, you submit through mbelibrary.org/questions. So this question is really about, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, of whether or not there was an Anglo-American version of a sense of religious superiority that came out of the war, that informed the war, and that was preserved afterwards. I mean, and you were referencing earlier a pre-talk that we had from Arthur Bright, and it's been the observation of some when they go into the Mapparium that what they are seeing is an Anglo-American perspective on the world, with the colonies that are broken out, et cetera, whereas the indigenous people might never have thought of themselves as belonging to French West Africa or to English colonial areas. That's how it's depicted in that room. So I'm just curious, your sense of to what extent is that reflected in what you've seen in those? Is that part of the story of having English and German facing in the periodicals? That's what this questioner, I think, is intrigued by.
Yeah. I think this gets to that point. Among the testimonies from English-speaking participants in the war, there were many who talked about how they had felt an eagerness for the war, and in some cases even felt that they had been prepared for the war by their reading of the Christian Science Journal and Sentinel. And when war was declared, they or their sons could not wait to sign up. There were, and I've looked at over 1,000 testimonies published in German in the span from 1912 to 1921. I did not see a single one expressing that sentiment. So I would say yes, there was an Anglo-American, because you see it in both testimonies from the United States and from England and Scotland, a feeling that this was very much God's work. They needed to participate.
Judy, have you seen any of that in what you've
Well, what
uncovered?
I've seen was that in 1922, the Christian Science Publishing Society was receiving correspondence from German speakers in both Austria and Germany who very much desired to see the Herald of Christian Science go back to an all-German magazine. They were also desirous of using the German-style type, again, which actually did happen, but the English did not leave the periodical. It was interesting to see the correspondence. Unfortunately, the records that I saw didn't really give any detail on what the reasoning was for the change, although I, perhaps looking forward to the 1930s and the 1940s, see that sense of nationalism perhaps beginning to arise in these post-war countries.
Yeah.
There was actually quite a bit of debate in Germany and other German-speaking countries about which style of type to use during the 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s. That's a rabbit hole that we don't need to go too far down, but it was very hotly debated among both intellectuals and just the general public. Which way do we want to go at this point? And interestingly, it was the Nazi regime that made the choice to go to the Latin alphabet rather than maintaining the German traditional script.
That is unusual.
Can I add, I think as we talk about this historical period and use the term Anglo-American, it's important to recognize that America circa 1915, 16, 17 is not America of 2016, 17, 18, that there is still really a project underway to Americanize really diverse linguistic, ethno-cultural, religious groups. And I mean, the war plays an important part in that. But I mean, we were talking again earlier today about this archival find that I had a number of years ago, a map of Northern Europe, actually all of Europe really, showing where American soldiers' families had chosen to repatriate, or to inter them rather than repatriate the remains. So large numbers of American families had chosen to have their sons who died in the war buried in Italy, in Ireland, some in Scandinavia, really evidencing the close connections that families are still feeling to European homelands. And I mean, yes, Woodrow Wilson and his cabinet are articulating a deeply racist understanding of America and a deeply Anglo sense of America. But there's really a lot of work that has to be done in terms of evangelizing America to get that to stick.
Well, I'd like to share another question, and this is for you primarily, John. And the questioner asks, it seems today that the experience of combat can cause a crisis or loss of faith. But 100 years ago, the American soldier was perhaps more religious than today. And then asks, can you say more about how combat itself was understood in religious terms?
Absolutely. I mean, what the sources that I've encountered say, and these are diaries and letters and memoirs, and also the Stars and Stripes, which was published for the first time during the Great War in France and published by American soldiers for American soldiers, is that combat is the place where one sees who one truly is and what really is true. And that the immediacy of death pops a lot of other things into focus. So having had that experience and come out of it alive, we shouldn't be surprised to see many young men claiming a sort of status as they return, or expecting a sort of recognition when they return as particularly privileged voices in American civil discourse. And that's really what the American Legion is. I mean, it's hard to rewind ourselves to a point where the American Legion does more than sponsor baseball teams and fish fries, but really it was an incredibly influential political lobby, or veterans lobby. They said they had policies, not politics. And they intentionally headquartered themselves in Indianapolis, not Washington, D.C. But that was an organization that worked very hard to cultivate a particular understanding of what it meant to be American, that the demands of the nation should trump those of church, and that Americans needed to be aggressive in developing preparedness and defense against incursions and domestic radicalisms and such.
This question has come in, and I guess it goes to you, primarily Christian, and it's asking, are there any testimonies by soldiers who engaged in personal combat and perhaps even had to deal with the issue of killing an enemy soldier?
Certainly. Certainly, yes and no. There are many testimonies by soldiers who were involved in combat, many of them along the lines of there were shells coming in all around and bullets flying, and I was completely unprotected, apparently, physically, materially, but I was perfectly safe, and the people around me were completely safe as well. Those testimonies often include reports of having engaged the enemy, returned fire in some way. Judy, I would defer to you in this, but I don't remember seeing anything saying, I had to kill people and here's how I needed to process that or deal with that or anything like that.
It is interesting, maybe some of the people here tonight have looked at a book that was published by the Christian Science Publishing Society in 1922 on the wartime activities of the church. And there are a number of testimonials in there or accounts of people, but I don't think there's a single one in there that recounts anyone's experience firing in battle, actually. They seem to be more focused on people's experiences, perhaps after a bad battle experience, either being injured, or they do talk about people who were suffering from what in those days they called shell shock, and then just the usual accounts of various soldiers who were dealing with various difficulties, some of them physical, some of them mental. It's really quite an interesting book. But there isn't anything in there about, well, there's at least one or two that talk about protection in time of battle, but nothing about shooting people.
Interesting. I know there's a lot of discussion today about moral injury. It's a term for people who do serve. The moral injury being that having engaged in combat and having engaged in perhaps hurting others, that their own inner sense of morality has been violated and injured, and needing to address that. And so I think this will be our final question for the panel, but it's for you, John, and it relates to this a little bit. I think the questioner asked, could you speak a bit about the aspects of soldiering you mentioned in World War I that no longer prevail in wars covered in your later books? Which elements in World War I are timeless and are still found today?
Camaraderie, for sure. The shared experience. And I mean, it's imperfect camaraderie, but the shared experience of mustering in, training, deploying, coming out, and being returned to American soil and reintegrating into American society. That's an enduring feature, that cycle. and you can see it written about, whether it's after the Great War. I mean, the amazing 1946 or 47 film, The Best Years of Our Lives, is all about that. I recommend, if you run, don't walk, to see that on Netflix. And then also, as I was referencing earlier, the amazing fiction that's come out of the Vietnam War and now out of Iraq and Afghanistan. The mysterium tremendum of combat, the thing that attracts people and repels them simultaneously. I see that as, I mean, veterans of the Civil War write about that, and veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, and certainly those of the Great War. And also the rhetorics and the idioms, architectural idioms that we use to cover up just how horrific killing and dying are in war. I mean, you referenced the scripture that, greater love hath no man than lay down his life for his friends. You don't lay down your life in war. I mean, it's ripped out of you, blown out of you, and that language isn't used. It's a much softer language that really, at that very fundamental level, obscures the reality and helps to perpetuate, I think, some of the myths of war that are still, that many of us are still in the thrall of. That's 3. The weapons change. One thing that's so interesting, just if I may, one thing that has changed is that I've spent a lot of time reading citations for the Congressional Medal of Honor out of World War I and World War II. You know what you don't see at all in World War I, or the Great War, is grenade covering. Not a single one. Not a single instance. Really 2 instances that I found of what people have called altruistic suicide, giving up one's life, laying down on top of an object, or accepting death so that someone else can have the last parachute or something. Doesn't happen in World War I. Partly because the technology of the grenade is so new, and it's not really known. It's countermeasures aren't fully developed, but the whole kind of narrative of this supreme sacrifice being that act isn't a part of the Great War. Just thought I'd share that.
Interesting. This discussion in making me think about Mary Baker Eddy, and I'm not going to remember this perfectly, but I think there was a time when somebody really wanted to understand what was essential to Christian Science healing. And as I recall, she said something to the effect of, it's just love, 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 love. And what's coming to me out of this discussion is that wars and conflicts of this test our capacity to love, and invite new ways of thinking of what love means, and deepens and challenges that idea.
It definitely does. I'll say something quickly here that was reminded by some of the things that John said earlier, and that was when I did my examination of the editorials in the Christian Science periodicals, that sense of love maybe was something that one didn't see quite as much as I had been anticipating, perhaps, when I started looking at the editorials that were written particularly in 1917 and 1918, and maybe in response to what was happening in all of the press in the United States. You find a fierce patriotism that seems very largely lacking in love, that seems far more black and white without any of that gray that we can see now as we start talking about war and its difficulties. I was disappointed to see, as I say, that black and white and no gray.
So perhaps this was an occasion that forced people of faith and religion subsequently to develop a more expansive idea and a more generous idea of love and how to see others from different nationalities, different persuasions. Well, one example of the way that this organization, this building, is called the Christian Science Publishing Society. One example of a form of outreach that I think came very much from a sense of wanting to extend love and embrace as much as possible was the creation of a small hymnal for soldiers in the field. And what you heard at the opening of our program was an arrangement from that hymnal. And we're going to, as a way of closing our program this evening, share a little bit more of that special hymnal that was created for soldiers and male voices in World War I. So I'm going to invite Dr. Ryan Vigil to come and speak a little bit about that hymnal, and then for us to share from some selections and enjoy some selections from it. So Ryan is hymn specialist here at the Christian Science Publishing Society. He's also on the faculty at the Faculty of Music at the University of New Hampshire.
Well, thank you. Delighted to have this opportunity. I'm not going to talk too much here because I'm sure we're all eager to get to the music. But I just thought I'd say a little bit about this booklet. It's called Hymns for Male Voices, and it was produced by the Christian Science Publishing Society in 1918. This is it. This is what it looks like. So this is how big it is, and it fits in a vest pocket. So to me, it's a particularly interesting and poignant primary source document from the time period we've been hearing about this evening. It's something that the Publishing Society created, which went out into the world and had a meaningful impact in the lives of those with whom it came into contact. I've got some imagery here. If you can't see the images too well, don't worry about that too much. All of the important points are things that I'm going to be reading quotations from. So what you're looking at right now is an image of the cover and title page from the booklet. And I'd like to read a little bit from the foreword, which speaks to what this is and why it was created. It says, "In order to supply a need in the singing of hymns by groups of men, this little book of carefully selected hymns arranged for male voices has been prepared. The selection has been made from the Christian Science hymnal, and it is believed that a very representative collection of the best religious and poetic thought in hymnology has been chosen. Furthermore, an effort has been made to make this selection of such a nature as to appeal to all lovers of church music of whatever taste or ability." I had the opportunity to consult a file in the archives of the Mary Baker Eddy Library containing original documents related to this little booklet, and I'd just like to tell its story in brief. The hymns were arranged by a gentleman named Leroy W. Allen, and we have a copy of a letter which was sent to him on December 5, 1917. It begins, "A request has come to the Publishing Society to issue a vest pocket pamphlet containing hymns from the Christian Science hymnal for use by the soldiers." It goes on to ask if this is something that he can arrange, and additional letters on file indicate that Mr. Allen was the primary musical arranger and editor of the pamphlet. We know that within a month of this letter, the selection of hymns and the layout of the pamphlet had been finalized. And Mr. Allen must have been a very fast worker because the booklets went into production in the first part of 1918 with new arrangements for male voices of 46 hymns. One of the most interesting documents in the archives is a list of song leaders at various training camps around the country to whom complimentary copies of the pamphlet were sent. These would be the training camps around the country where the soldiers were training and assembling and preparing to ship overseas. There are other similar lists on file as well. For now, I'll call your attention to the name of Herbert S. Salmond, stationed in Brooklyn, New York, to whom we will be returning very soon. We also have a copy of a letter written on Christian Science Publishing Society letterhead that went to a Mr. David Griffin, headquartered at Camp Jackson, South Carolina. And we can reasonably assume that this letter is similar to the ones that went out to all the song leaders on that list. It begins, "This society has just issued a selection of well-known hymns arranged for male voices and printed in a booklet of vest pocket size, which can be conveniently handled by the soldiers and sailors. We are sending you herewith 6 complimentary copies, which we trust you will find useful in your work among the boys. If you should desire more copies in connection with your office as song leader, we shall be glad to send you such additional copies with our compliments." Returning to the aforementioned Herbert S. Salmond of Brooklyn, New York, the files include this handwritten response. Dear Sir, received 6 copies of the hymns for male voices, for which I thank you. I can use 500 of them to good advantage, and would be pleased to have you send them to me for camp use if you will. The boys want one as soon as they see them. You have met a great need with such a useful little book, particularly as it has the music and not merely the words, as in other little publications. And there are many similar letters in the files. I could quote from lots of them, but in the interest of time, I'd like to just skip ahead and quote from a follow-up letter to Mr. Allen, the arranger and editor. This is from March of 1918, and it reads in part, "You will be glad to know that the songbook has been well received by the song leaders in the various camps. One song leader, for instance, asked us to send 500 copies." I think this is a reference to Mr. Salmond. While several have stated that they could give away just as many as the Publishing Society could possibly forward. One can only imagine that Mr. Allen must have been delighted to know that the booklets were going out all over the country, and indeed in the pockets of countless soldiers, going out all over the world. Now, as a musician and a lover of hymns, I am admittedly somewhat biased, but I have to say I'm touched that one of the many responses of this organization to the events of the war was the creation of this little hymnal for the soldiers. So I'm going to ask our men's choir to begin assembling here. We're going to treat you now to 3 more hymns, which, along with the hymns that opened the program, Onward Christian Soldiers, give a good sense of the range of hymns included in the booklet. We'll begin with Shepherd, Show Me How to Go, which I'll note, since this is an event put on by the Mary Baker Eddy Library, has words written by Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer and founder of Christian Science. We will follow with In Heavenly Love Abiding, and we will close with He Leadeth Me, 3 hymns from Hymns for Male Voices, published in 1918 by the Christian Science Publishing Society.
Shepherd, show me how to go o'er the hillside steep.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Men's Choir. I couldn't help but imagine going back 100 years' time and seeing you in sort of dress fatigues or whatever the right term would have been, but just imagining the amount of comfort and support, being able to have that song available to those men and people serving there and in harm's way often, what it must have given them, because it certainly gave it to me just now in peacetime. So thanks so much for your beautiful singing and the time I know you put in to do such a fine performance. And thanks so much to our panelists, to you, John, and to you, Judy, and to you, Christian, to help us kind of explore and understand this time period and what was at stake for people in their religious convictions, what it asked of them in that way, how religious organizations responded to a very complicated international situation, and the conflict that it involved. It's one of the reasons that I think history is so relevant to the present, because it forces us to, if we look at it, to understand what those lessons were, what those experiences were, and to bring that consciousness, bring that understanding to what we're engaged with in our current lives and experience, both individually and collectively. So it's been very meaningful for me, and I really appreciate all the thought and effort that you put into preparing your remarks and in your careers just generally dealing with this kind of content. So thank you all, and thank you so much to both our on-site and our online audience. It's just a privilege to be able to share these kinds of programs with you, and thank you for your attention. It was felt, and that spirit is so important to us who are sharing what we research and what we know and what we've put together as an offering for you. So thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you again here at the Mary Baker Eddy Library.